Hello and welcome to another Frontline recap. We'll be looking at the major events in the week around Russia and the war in Ukraine and discussing some of the Times Radio expert analysis that we've seen this week. Now, the first one I want to talk about is some analysis from George Boris from the Institute for the Study of War. Now, he was talking about the casualty figures that we're seeing overall and the potential for Russian general mobilization.
Well, the Russian casualty rate across the entire theater is not sustainable. We've talked about this for a long time, but all the open source intelligence indicates that the Russians lose between, on average, 30,000 troops per month, killed and wounded. In the quarter four of 2024, the Russians pushed harder because I think they're sprinting at the end of a marathon, and they were losing closer to 40 or 45 casualties per month. So when North Korea gifted the Russians 10,000 soldiers back in the fall, that was really just roughly 10 days worth of soldiers if you were to aggregate it across the entirety of the theater. Now, within Kursk itself specifically, we've not been able to confirm independently the number of North Koreans killed or wounded because we actually we're not prepared to look at people's faces and pictures and say, yep, those are North Koreans versus Asiatic Russians living, coming from Eastern Siberian parts of Russia. However, that's all consistent with the reports that we've gotten from Pentagon officials and UK officials and Ukrainian officials. I think it was just about a couple weeks ago, the Pentagon claimed that the Russians have taken on about 1,000 casualties, a battalion being between 500 and 1,000 in total, which was over the course of several weeks of fighting. And then that was before that the Russians even started to decisively deploy North Koreans in these wave attacks. The purported combat footage that we've seen of the North Koreans being used shows them being used as dismounted infantry without vehicle support, being marched across fields to go seize tactical land, and the Ukrainians engaging them relatively effectively because that is not a particularly effective use of infantry. But you make gains that way, but it comes at a tremendous human cost. And the frontline villages where the North Koreans are reportedly fighting, where, according to Russian reports, they are indeed frontline towns, and they are indeed the places where the Ukrainians are attacking in some areas new as well. So it's not inconceivable that you would see up to a battalion's worth of casualties over a 48-hour period. That actually occurs in other parts of the theater too. Just yesterday, there was a Ukrainian brigade commander in the Kursk area in southeastern Ukraine who reported that about a battalion's worth of Russians are killed and wounded per day there as well, about 400 guys a day. So the hotspots are really hot.
I mean, there has been speculation for so long as to whether Putin will be forced to launch a fresh wave of mobilization to try and address the casualty rate. How do you rate the chances of that happening at some point in the coming months, George?
I think if we can hold the Russians to the current tempo of operations where they continue to lose between 20 to 30K guys a month, it's a question of time. When will Putin have to call mobilization? Because really starting since the fall, we've seen the system for Russian force generation, the system by which they generate volunteers by using insane financial incentives, economic incentives, it's become less effective. The system's not working as well as it used to. You can plot the XY graph for how much the various Russian regions are now offering for these one-time enlistment bonuses and so on and so forth. I mean, just yesterday, the Oblast in, I believe it was Samara, they broke the record with a now 4 million ruble one-time signing bonus. That's about $36,000 USD. The average Russian annual salary is 1.2 million rubles. So you can basically make 4 times the annual salary in Russia just by in a one-time sign-up bonus, which is absurd. And of course, this is breaking the Russian economy in real time. Inflation is a major deal within Russia. The overnight insurance rate is, I have to double check. Last I checked, this is before the Russian central bank met in late December, but it was 21%. They were reportedly going to raise it to 23%. Russia's burning through its sovereign wealth fund, right? Everyone's flush with this Ministry of Defense cash. But that's just causing a whole lot of inflation. And it's not sustainable from the Russian economic perspective. Neither is it sustainable from the Russian force generation perspective, because it feeds into an existing Russian labor deficit. They have over 1 million vacancies in the workplace due to tremendous number of people going to go fight and die. And so I really do see it as a question of time. Putin wants to stave off for as long as possible the requirement to have to do mobilization. And I think that's part of the reason why the Kremlin is actually doing this sticks and carrots, charm and coercion offensive now with the Oreshnik ballistic missile strikes, and while also simultaneously trying to go into negotiations, because Putin would love to off-ramp himself from the current collision course that he has with difficult decisions and accumulated risk coming down the pike in the next several months. But look, provided that the current tempo of operations keeps going, I think Putin will have to call mobilization within the next 18 to 24 months. I don't know exactly when.
We've seen, and this has been confirmed by UK Defence Intelligence, an average of between 1,400 and 1,600 casualties, Russian casualties, every day through 2024. Russian casualty figures are getting up to approximately 750,000 at the moment. Those figures have come out from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defence and are backed by UK Defence Intelligence and other Western intelligence sources. And they're a mix of Russian dead and individuals so severely wounded that they will not come back onto the front line again. That's unheard of. These levels are completely unsustainable. And as Russia looks at trying to replace the individuals, the casualties on the front line, they're getting more and more soldiers coming through with less training. They're using them in meat waves in their attacks against the Ukrainians to try and force the Ukrainians to run out of ammunition. And that's effectively how they're capturing a lot of the territory, but at huge, huge unsustainable cost. Vladimir Putin is now heavily recruiting in Africa, in the likes of Yemen, but also getting troops in from North Korea. He signed a defense pact with North Korea, and it wouldn't surprise me if we see in 2025 even more North Korean troops being brought forward and integrated into the Russian military. That is very, very difficult indeed to get a cohesive, coherent military force where you haven't practiced together, you haven't exercised together, you haven't worked together, and you've got a huge language barrier. So it's going to cause Putin massive problems. He won't want general mobilization in Russia, because if he does that, he's already suffering with his workforce in his defense industrial base. There aren't enough people to man the jobs to keep the manufacturing going that's needed to sustain the operations and produce the artillery, the ammunition, the tanks, the armoured vehicles, and repair those and the spare parts that are needed to sustain operations. So George's insights and the Institute for Study of War insights are fascinating. I use that as one of my sources on a daily basis. The next commentary we get is from General Chip Chapman. Chip is again talking about mobilization, but talking about Putin's position from a political perspective in Russia, and the fact that he has effectively been in power for 25 years, whether it's president, prime minister, and back to president again. But what we're seeing now is an overall degradation of the Russian economy and a degradation of Russia's ability to continue to prosecute the war.
Mobilization is a societal risk for him. The economy is a risk, but he doesn't have that elite defection at the moment. And as long as you've got this digital authoritarianism within the regime, and he's been there a long time now, approaching 25 years in one form or another as prime minister or president, then you still got a very benign population. This really goes back to our old friend in the Wagner group, Prigozhin, when he sort of said we might have to live like North Korea for a few years to ensure that we're successful in Ukraine. And it might be the fact that they do that. And sometimes you can overplay the amount that sort of the degradation of an economy can have an impact. Because, for example, I remember when I was doing the sort of job for real, in 2012, the Syrian economy, all the indicators there were red, and yet that sustained itself for another 12 years. So you can live through a lot of inflation, you can live through a lot of economic imbalances if you really choose to do so. It's whether those fractures start coming, I think, in the population, which are the key thing to look for. And that really is to do with the mobilization. You can mobilize people, but one of the things which is significant is the losses. So the figures which came out for 2024 suggested that the Russians had lost 3,000 tanks and 9,000 armored fighting vehicles in 2024. Now, when we're talking about what's happened in the last 2 days, the Russians overnight, night of 5th, 6th, lost 14 tanks and 45 AFVs, along with 62 artillery systems. That level of loss is unsustainable in terms of having effective mechanized operations, which is why you are seeing this sort of devolving of civilian vehicles and sort of Mad Max type vehicles appearing on the battlefield for Russia. It's not that they've completely run out of vehicles, but there'll be a time when they culminate in equipment which is valid in terms of a modern fighting force. One thing you can say about the Kursk incursion at the moment, even though it is small scale, is that in the sword versus the shield, it seems that there's been effective use of electronic warfare by the Ukrainians to negate the drones of the Russians. One of the things we're likely to see later on this month is that in the Ramstein meeting, the drone coalition, now the Ramstein meetings are taken over by NATO, and the drone coalition is led by the UK, that there will be an even greater preponderance of drones by Ukraine this year, partly led through that and partly by indigenous production. And that's also one of the things that the Ukrainians have future-proofed themselves in, which is their missile and drone production for the day that Trump comes and may not give them any further support. So that future-proofing is there, and the Ukrainians are very cannily using drones and electronic warfare as a force multiplier to make up for those deficiencies that they absolutely have in manpower. No one wants to join the infantry at the moment in Ukraine, and that is a structural and mobilization weakness within the Ukrainian armed forces too.
That's absolutely fascinating. So much to unpick there. Just on the Russian supply issues, I mean, we've spoken so much about the Russian casualty rate and whether that is sustainable. Do you think that too many people have ignored for too long the supply issues that Russia also have?
I think so. It was a fascinating thing about, the drones are actually being used as a consumable item in the way that a bullet was a consumable item for NATO forces in the past. So again, really what we're talking about is the deep battle by both Russia in terms of the electricity infrastructure in Ukraine and the Ukrainian attacks on the oil production and gas production in Russia. Now, of course, one of the things that the Ukrainians have done over the Christmas period too is absolutely stop the transit of Russian gas across their terrain to Europe. Now, all this plays into the sort of potential collapse of the economy in the future. It also plays into the fact that both the attacks on the oil and gas facilities and on their logistic hubs make it more difficult for Russia to go towards any meaningful operations in the future. But as I keep saying, they still believe they're sort of winning. Their rate of advance from August to December was slightly quicker than it's been in the past. But, 6 months ago, James, we were talking about Pokrovsk, and here we are. They still haven't breached the third and fourth lines of defense, which lead up to Pokrovsk. And they may take it, but they're not going to take it again for another 6 months. Within that period, we've got 5 months of Trump being there. And again, the situation could change significantly because of that factor.
And this ties in very much with what George was saying. It's the fact that if Putin goes for mobilization and a more general mobilization across Russia, he's going to take away a lot of key individuals who are the experienced individuals in the manufacturing companies around Russia that are helping to sustain the operations on the front line. We saw this in the UK and other allied countries during the Second World War, and this is where we had to get the Women's Land Army, and we saw a lot of our munitions factories being staffed by women because all the men were going to the front line. As soon as Putin starts to do that, then what that will do is it'll bring the pressures that he's under and the horrors of the casualties into the the awareness of the Muscovites and those from St. Petersburg, the European Russians, in a way that he's managed to keep it away from them as much as possible to date. And that will put real pressure on Vladimir Putin. And our final video of the week comes from Matthew Saville, who is from RUSI, and he's looking at things from a slightly different angle. He's talking about the tactics that we're seeing on the battlefield.
What came out, and it's worth noting this is from a variety of sources, some of which are Russian, is that, for example, the operation over the weekend in Kursk appeared to be more successful than previous ones in terms of using a combination of armour and troops that were mechanized and electronic warfare to create windows where Russian observation was obscured or denied, and therefore the Ukrainians were able to coordinate that with how they advanced. There's an ongoing battle about spotting forces on the battlefield. I mean, this is across the line. And then the ability to bring in artillery, for example. In many areas, artillery is still absolutely vital, but there are some cases where, particularly on the Ukrainian side, they have used first-person view drones and other systems to compensate for either their reduced artillery supplies or targets of opportunity popping up. Although I would add that the most recent reporting suggests that there have been some parts of the front line where that large gap in artillery supply that was in play last year has been narrowed or indeed eradicated. So the delay caused by particularly the big US package at the start of last year harmed the Ukrainian cause. But lots of that material is now in the system and is flowing in. The other thing that's come up recently that the people who really look into the detail on this have pointed out is the increasing use of fiber optic cable on drones because that helps you reduce or sometimes eliminate the ability of the adversary to jam your drone. And by that we mean a drone is literally connected by a kilometers long cable to an operator or an offset control point, which means you are flying it whilst it's trailing cable for 10 or 15 kilometers, a very fine cable, to then conduct a strike. And I'm sure we'll then see a response to that, and that there will be countermeasures applied to get at the cable or track it back to its source, or to interfere with the ability of the drone to physically get to its target. So, that battle will continue to evolve. That isn't the end point of that evolution, but that's the kind of thing that's going on around the ground on the front line.
And he's talking about the tactics of how this is highlighted once again that it's not all about technology on one hand, where we're seeing unsophisticated tactics back to First World War type trench warfare, back to armoured manoeuvre, tank on tank, artillery duels, infantry fighting in trenches, and knife fighting and guttural fighting that we're seeing. But he then goes on to explain about how, on the other hand, there's the technological advances that we're seeing. And the technological advances are in particular in the electronic warfare sectors, but also looking at drone warfare as well. And that translates into tactical advances and changing the way tactics are happening on the ground. And this isn't happening just on the Ukrainian side, but we're seeing the Russians doing it. The Russians are very good at learning where they're getting things wrong, trying to change their tactics, using the assets that they've got, and then use those in a slightly different way. However, unfortunately, they don't have the trained personnel who can be flexible in their tactics. They don't have the doctrine in the way they operate to allow flexibility. And a lot of these changes, whilst they're bringing them in, are having difficulty having any real effect on the front line. Where they are having an effect is from an electronic perspective, and Russia is adapting very quickly to a lot of the electronic challenges that we're seeing across the board, in particular with their drone technology and their electronic warfare technology in countering what the Ukrainians are doing. It's a battle. Both the Ukrainians and the Russians are effectively doing the same thing. From a tactics perspective, the Ukrainians are bringing in more maneuver warfare, more Western type tactics, and they're changing that as they're in contact with the Russians. The one area where we've seen them use properly combined arms operations, integrating some new capabilities, in particular their drones and all the rest of it with their armoured manoeuvre, their artillery and everything else, is in their operations in Kursk. But then the Ukrainians are using some of their better troops in doing that. The technological advances we're seeing with the drones tie in with producing drones that are not susceptible to normal electronic warfare. And then we're seeing adaptations in electronic warfare to try and counter them. The Ukrainians did that very well in Kursk. But we're also seeing both sides developing drones that are controlled by fiber optic cable. So trailing kilometers of fiber optic cable behind them so that they're not subject to electronic warfare. However, natural environment is proving difficult in many cases as they fly over wooded areas where the cable becomes snagged and snaps. And it's then who has got the best electronics programmed into the drone for it to continue on and be able to fly its mission. And that is a challenge. But what we're seeing on both sides is adaptation in tactics, adaptation in technology, combined with the old-fashioned First World War type guttural warfare, and it's horrible. So the video that we're seeing here is from the Russians, and it's clearly from a Russian drone, and it's looking at a Ukrainian advance with a mine-ploughed armoured vehicle going through a field, could easily be a field of corn or could be a field of sunflower, and then coming in and attacking the mine plough. That mine plough is clearing a clear path for armoured vehicles to come through afterwards. And then the Russian video goes on to show them their FPV drones attacking and destroying 2 to 3 Ukrainian tanks as they advance across one line. In itself, this is one line of advance. This isn't a major attack, but it's showing the Russian capability. Then we go on to, and this is some Ukrainian pictures from the Ukrainian artillery in the Kharkiv region, and it's the Ukrainians firing 152 millimeter towed artillery pieces against the Russians in there. But what it shows is that the Ukrainians are still using the old Soviet-style artillery pieces and Soviet-style weapons. They've got a lot of those. They seem to have here enough ammunition, and as we heard from Matthew Saville in his piece, the ammunition supplies seem to have been resolved in the Ukrainian side, and this is not a shoot and scoot scenario which you see with the mobile artillery. So clearly the Ukrainian gunners are content that the Russians are not in a position to fire back. So that's our recap of the events this week. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to put your comments below and sign up for a Times Radio membership for more exclusive content. If you get your comments in, we'll try and answer them in our Q&A sessions as well. Thank you for watching, and have a good week.